Hello, I'm Ed Butler and welcome to In the Balance, the BBC World Service programme that examines the biggest stories from the world of business and finance and looks at how they affect us all. Today, our theme is the universal or unconditional basic income, or simply known as the basic income. The idea is to give everybody in a society a set chunk of money which guarantees them a minimum survivable standard of living. This in turn might obviate the need for other types of cash benefit that are currently being given to the needy in wealthier countries, for example. So a blanket cash handout then. It's not something that's yet been tried on a national level, but there have been a number of pilot projects, such as this one launched in Madhya Pradesh in India in 2011. In 8 villages in the state, every man, woman and child was provided with a monthly payment of initially 200 rupees for the adults and 100 for each child. Afterwards, recipients said it had transformed their ability to improve their lives and generate better additional income streams for themselves.
From the money we got, we constructed our house. We built it economically without taking any loans from anyone. Then we also got our daughter married, again without borrowing any money. Earlier we had to borrow money from big shots, landowners. We'd tell the moneylender we needed 10,000 rupees and he'd say, "Come over, take it," but on an interest of 10%. We had to agree, we had no choice. Then he'd set a date for repayment, and if we failed to pay up, he'd take away something valuable from our home, or we'd have to sell some assets to make the payment. That's not happening now. I don't have to suffer anymore.
We decided to put our village pond to some use. 12 members got together to form an informal committee and collected money to buy fish for breeding. For 24,000 rupees, we got 109,000 fish. They're in the pond right now, and we will fish some out in summer, and still there will be many left for later.
Earlier, we weren't allowed to step outside the house. Our husbands would say, "Why do you have to go out?" So we would hide our faces and didn't speak in front of them. But now, they don't question us. Earlier, many people used to drink a lot, but now most have given up. A bottle of liquor costs 20 rupees. Why not save this money and buy groceries instead? Because drinking will only create friction at home.
Some happy, abstemious, basic income receiving Indian villagers there. Well, it's not just in developing economies that this idea has been piloted. Finland and the Netherlands are trying it out again on a limited scale in early 2017. The Swiss had a referendum on introducing a very generous scheme nationwide earlier this year, although that failed to pass. And there have been other experiments in the past as well, some of which we'll no doubt be discussing. Joining me now to talk about all of this are Professor Louise Haag, a reader of politics at the University of York and the chair of the Basic Income Earth Network, and Michael Fay, a co-founder of the non-profit organisation Give Directly, which is piloting its own project in Kenya at the moment. Also here I'm joined by 2 economists with different views on the scheme. Michael Tanner, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute in Washington, and Ian Goff, a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. Welcome to you all. Michael Fay, first of all, tell us a little bit about this project that you are involved in Kenya, how the scheme might theoretically work there and be rolled out.
We have learned something profound over the last 20 years or so, which is that simply giving people cash and letting them make decisions for themselves is more effective than the experts or the institutions making decisions for them. We're launching what I think is the most ambitious social experiment of a generation. We're providing enough money to live for about 25,000 people in East Africa and meet their basic needs. That turns out to be about 75 cents a day. And for about 75 cents a day, you should be able to meet what is the basic poverty line, food, shelter, and so on.
You've got, a 15-year project going ahead here?
So we've just started this specific project. What we have been doing for 8 years, and governments in Africa, Kenya and otherwise have been doing for a lot longer, is providing direct transfers to the people. And you see impact on education, you see it on health, you see people investing the money.
Professor Louise Haag of the Basic Income Earth Network, you presumably have studied all of the pilots that have happened over decades now around this. Is there a body of evidence about what we're seeing about the pluses and minuses of the basic income?
Yes, I'm trying to keep up with the many varieties of experiments that are going on, and indeed in the last 2 years have accelerated, not just in developing countries, but now also in the mature welfare states. But having said that, I think the case for basic income does not solely rely on evidence that we can gather from experiments in basic income itself, but also on evidence of dysfunction of the current welfare state, both in mature welfare states and as this is being rolled out across developing countries.
Dysfunction in what sense?
There is a basic humanist as well as a strong institutional case in terms of functionality for a basic income reform, by which I mean at a minimum a level of income support at the level of current income assistance benefits, whether that be cash grants in developing countries or that be income assistance systems in mature welfare states, because as the labour market has grown weak, employment has become more precarious, unstable, and unemployment has risen. The state's response to this has been ineffective in the form of a rise of new punitive measures to get the unemployed into work that really are not compatible with the modern welfare state and the humanist ethos of the modern welfare state.
Right. I mean, part of the point you're making, I guess, is that welfare is generally based on perceived need. In other words, if you're feeling in need, you have to prove it before you can receive welfare in many of these countries.
Correct. And I think there has been a basic error in the construction of the welfare state, which has become apparent over time as labour markets have grown weaker, which is the idea that you need to be deserving in this way to get a bare minimum of subsistence when we already accept, for example, access to healthcare, access to education as entitlements.
Right, but the difference here is that you would be proposing the giving of money, a basic level of money in presumably any economy in the world, to every single citizen. So that would include the richest as well as the poorest.
Yes, but you can work out this scheme in such a way that in effect, in monetary terms, it primarily benefits the less well-off.
How would you do that? That would still mean means testing of some form.
Not necessarily. What we're proposing, and of course there are many varieties of ways in which you can imagine transitioning into a basic income, but increasingly what people are thinking as a bare minimum is a form of cost-neutral, gradual transition in which you use the existing tax benefit systems and change the nature of the entitlement. So in effect, you're not necessarily giving people more money. Those who are already on benefits will get them unconditionally, which is the big change. And what this will mean is that they will have a greater incentive to work because any earnings that they earn above will not be lost in benefits.
But hang on a second there. You just said cost neutral. You're saying that everybody, no matter what their wealth, starts getting the same amount of money they're getting now. That's huge amounts of additional cost to the exchequer, to the government, isn't it?
It depends on how you work out the sums. But what is true is that if you're going to do it in a relatively cost neutral way, you will be starting with a very low level of basic income. And that will mean that you will still need some means-tested benefits on top. And indeed, that is what most people now envisage, is that you will combine the basic entitlement with other forms of benefits that already exist in the welfare state.
I saw one estimate, for example, around Switzerland's proposal, the one that they voted on in a referendum earlier this year. It said the proposed deal involved something like $2,500 per adult across the country, and that would involve a tripling of the country's federal spending. I mean, it would mean huge additional costs.
Yes, that is an unusual proposal. It is a very high level of basic income that they had in mind, and indeed they're entitled to propose that. But as basic income has entered public policy debate in a serious way, most schemes, most studies and analysts now envisioning or thinking about ways in which you can implement the basic income in a gradual way. And the main benefit in the context of certainly the European welfare state is really a change in the way in which citizens relate to the state, in which the unemployed relate to social workers and the institutions that help facilitate their participation in society, so that that can take on a different form. I call it a form of relational freedom, because what we have now is an increasing use of punitive measures that creates a dysfunctional relationship between citizens and the state.
Michael Tanner, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, you've been listening to this. What are your initial thoughts about this general idea in principle?
Well, I think in principle there's a very strong case for it. I think that moving to cash and away from the sort of categorical in-kind benefits that most welfare states provide is always a preferable option. It is far less paternalistic and gives people far more better incentives within the system. The problem is in implementation and the practicalities of implementation, that if you were to grant a truly universal benefit, it would be prohibitively expensive. In the United States, providing everybody with an income at the poverty level would be something like $4 trillion US, which is larger than the entire federal budget right now. So I think that's not practical. What you are much more likely to end up with, as you suggested earlier, was some sort of means-tested program, something like a negative income tax. The problem with any program like that is in the phase-out range, you begin to create a disincentive for work because for every dollar you earn outside the program, you begin to lose a portion of your benefits, and you have to watch that very carefully.
OK, Ian Gough.
Let me start off by saying that talking about developing countries isn't very helpful for us who are facing these issues in developed countries. So I think we need to separate out the two issues. In the richer countries, we have, in many ways, basic income. We have things called social security, and they provide income for people in particular categories or in particular states of need. So, of course, I, as a supporter of that, would have no objection. The problem is having universal basic income, unconditional, and that is either unaffordable or it just cannot provide a decent level of security.
It will just be a nudge up, but it won't actually sustain you.
Exactly. It's a partial basic income, and that's what's always advocated, with the honourable exception of the Swiss referendum.
OK, everyone has set out their cases here, and we're going to drill down into a lot of the debate about all of that in just a moment. You are listening to In the Balance from the BBC World Service. I would like to now introduce our own regular columnist into the discussion. It's Colm O'Regan, comedian and sometime management consultant. He has his own thoughts on the unconditional cash handout.
It was always going to be a bad time of year for me to consider free money for others. I'm filing and paying my self-assessment tax. For those who are taxed as they earn, they may not understand the psychology of paying your taxes all in one go. When your tax is deducted automatically from your wages, you never had it. You never spent it in your mind or in reality. If you were public-spirited, you could be sanguine. You could pretend that your particular taxes have been spent in a library in which a child with poor parents first picked up a science book, inspiring them to become the woman who cured the disease that would otherwise have killed you. When I saw my cheque off last week, however, I immediately imagined it spent badly by the government, maybe on the pension of a former minister who had fiddled while the country's financial system burned, or on social welfare of someone I haughtily deemed morally weak and undeserving. So the idea of free money for everyone was always going to be a tough sell for me. I can practically picture some of the people who would be getting it, and a little nerve above my eye twitches. But that was last week, and I've had a chance to think about it. First, there's the costs. If you give people money, what do you take away to pay for it? Will the right money be taken away from the right people? Once you've worked that out, you need to ask, how are people going to behave when they get the money? For some reason, people don't always behave the way economists predict, simply because economists and planners don't live most people's lives. They can't. It's a logistical thing, and there isn't much data to work off. It's hard to persuade a whole country to try it. Switzerland rejected it. I suspect some of the rejection was because of the suggestion that they should give around $620 per child. Whatever about pocket money for adults, giving children money without some form of national programme of enforced washing up, tidying their rooms and helping their parents around the house without the threat of withdrawal if they misbehaved was never going to fly. If only there was a large country that was willing to take a huge leap of faith on an untested option, an option that fundamentally challenged all existing, perceived, received and conventional wisdom as it has been disseminated by the elites, a country that would simply bring in basic income because of its very difference, not in spite of it. Because heck, why not give it a try? Because the system was broken already. Obviously, they should bring in basic income immediately across the United States. If they're willing to take a chance on Donald Trump, maybe they'll take a punt on this.
Colm O'Regan in Dublin there. Michael Tanner from the Cato Institute. I better bring you in here. Any chance the Trump administration is going to take it up as a policy initiative?
Well, I think it's not likely to happen anytime soon, and I think it would be premature to try to take it up in a serious way. We lack data, particularly in the developed world. We have a number of experiments going on. We should be waiting for that. Still, I do think there's a chance for broad bipartisan support ultimately. You see people like Charles Murray on the libertarian right, along with people on the left supporting these type of proposals. It offers a chance to sort of reform the existing welfare state, which there's a consensus is failing, in a way that might be both more humane and more efficient.
Michael Fay, the point has been raised that your experiments over there in Kenya, frankly, have very little relevance when it comes to rich world experiments.
I think there's no question that the policy questions the rich world are facing and the specific constraints are quite different. Even within the rich world, you have the Scandinavian countries, which are quite different than the U.S. However, we can learn a lot from what we are doing in the emerging markets. Even if you look at the debates happening in Canada, Switzerland, and other places, they're referencing the literature on cash transfers from India, from Mexico, from other places. What we do know is that cash transfers are effective. Universal basic income is a special type of cash transfer. We don't know much about how that compares to the other types of cash programs that countries are running.
Ian Goff, I mean, is that a valid point that handing cash to those who wish to spend it is a more effective way of providing benefits to people than simply giving them services?
No, I don't always agree with that. It's appealing, but just consider healthcare. Basically, cash commodifies. If you're just giving people money, they have to purchase everything, which we take for granted now. Education, gradually privatising, and health services and so forth. So, and numerous problems there with privatised health systems, as we see in the US. Publicly provided health systems, which exist in every other advanced country, are much more effective.
What Ian is saying is not what is being proposed by most basic income supporters. Agreed. The idea that there is a trade-off between universal healthcare, between state-provided education, or even other aspects of the welfare state and the basic income is completely false.
You're saying that all of those things will be provided free and then you'll just throw extra money on top?
No, what I'm saying is we need a change in the design of institutions of entitlement to basic income assistance. As a start, we already have things like tax exemptions and personal allowance that benefit those on the higher end of the income scale. Those could be transformed and rolled into a new basic income scheme. The idea is, on a political level, to give everyone a similar stake in the welfare state, but that is not in any way a trade-off for other services in kind that are already provided. So indeed, the transition into something like this, it's not a radical reform, but it's a very important and timely one. There is not a single model or way of doing it, but it's certainly not true that those who advocate basic income advocate it as an alternative to welfare services benefits in kind.
That's not necessarily true in the United States. I think that most people on the right who support universal basic income in the United States do see it as a substitute for most of the 120-odd existing social welfare programs that the United States operates.
For some of them, it's a substitute. For some of them, it will be those that pay other form of monetary benefits. But you're right that there is a debate in the basic income movement and there's different opinions as to what the scheme should look like.
Ian Goff.
Yeah, I think that's losing the central point. The right arguments for it are completely different, as we've heard. They want to run down to move towards a minimal state and commodify the production of services. Those of us on the left can see the dangers in this because as well as costing a basic income, you have to continue paying for all the state services.
Well, I'm sorry, it's not a coincidence that you see the basic income being experimented with, even spontaneously, in the Scandinavian welfare states.
Well, this was my other point. You can't experiment with something which is a complete system change. This is a revolutionary, radical shift.
No, it isn't.
So
I completely disagree.
Just to move to a few villages or towns, you can't model that.
Louise, there is one point. For example, inflation. Plenty of people think that if you were to inject significant additional money into the money supply across a whole nation, not just in a small series of communities, you might indeed fuel inflation.
It's completely red herring. What I'm proposing is that we should look at this reform as a change in the design of the way in which people are entitled to things that they're already getting. We already have made commitments to support people in need, and we already have made commitments to the personal tax allowance and tax exemptions of various kinds. What I'm proposing is we change the nature of the entitlement in a way that makes what people are already getting now more humane. And that is indeed what they're doing in the Nordic states right now. They are realizing that what they're doing right now is expensive, is costly and ineffective, and they're simply trying to lift the conditionalities as a first step. And this is happening in several municipalities in Denmark, for example, and it's also happening in municipalities in France.
Nordic states, though, which are already pretty high welfare countries, aren't they? I mean, in relative terms.
Yes, of course. And we have seen studies that show that it would be difficult for some countries that have lower levels of taxation to introduce a basic income scheme. And this relates to a different point, which is that you should not look at basic income as a radical revolutionary reform that replaces other important progressive ideas. We do need a new deal in terms of taxation. We do need a new development model. And the basic income is not a substitute for those other important reforms.
I think there's an important distinction to be made between the provision of public goods, national security, healthcare, infrastructure, and the provision of private goods, things like food aid, housing vouchers, and so on. From my perspective, a lot of those private goods can move to cash as an intermediate step to a universal basic income. We are currently spending a lot of money on food aid. We are sending food. We're sending shoes. We're dumping a lot of things on the emerging markets, and we're doing a lot of private good transfers domestically as well. A lot of those programs can move to cash. And as a second point, I think you can de-link a lot of those benefits from work, getting rid of the disincentive to work. Mm-hmm. That is the essence of basic income, and I think we can take steps on that path now.
Ian Goff, do you think it's credible that you could introduce some very moderate form of basic income, as described by Louise there, without substantially lifting or raising the burden, the tax burden on the average?
Well, I wish I could, but I don't think you can. If you take as the poverty line about half of national average incomes, then it doesn't take much to work out that would require a tax rate of 50% across the board in order to finance it. Now, you can claw back lots of tax expenditures. I agree, there is scope there, but it's not going to go anywhere near enough to meet that. So we're talking about a big extra cost. And then you need to look at the alternative you could spend that money on. There's a huge number of investments and so forth which need to be made.
Away from the number crunching, let's just look a little bit at the incentives or whether it would add or disincentivize labour, for example. I mean, there is a big argument about that, isn't there, Michael Tanner? It will either get people out of a welfare trap or indeed it might sort of put them in one because it's going to disincentivize them from doing more work if they were getting this basic income.
But we should also recognize that the existing social welfare systems create a huge disincentive to work. Some of the highest marginal tax rates in the world are for someone who goes off the dole and takes a job. In some countries in Europe, the marginal tax rate is close to 100% between the increase in taxes they begin to pay, the loss of benefits, and then the extraneous costs that apply to going to work. You actually can end up worse off. Guaranteed national income or universal basic income could, depending on how it was designed, deal with those disincentives. The problem is that the further up the income scale you go to deal with the disincentive problem, the more expensive it becomes. And otherwise you end up with a big cliff again as you start to fall off where people lose money as they take a job.
In the version you would like to see, presumably you'd be taking away all these other benefits that are currently available to US citizens and just dropping them into this general scheme.
That's right. I think that we should give people cash. We should treat them like adults, essentially, expect them to budget and not treat them like a 3-year-old that we get to decide what they should spend their money on. Why should we determine how much goes to housing, how much goes to food, how much goes to health care, how much goes to education? Shouldn't they make the same decisions that middle class and wealthy people make?
Michael Tanner makes the key point, which is that currently a lot of benefits are linked to work. If we can find a way to de-link benefits with something like universal basic income, we may be able to get rid of that disincentive. And I think there's another point here, which is that a lot of the jobs people are taking on the lower end of the income spectrum are especially bad. There's a wonderful paper by 2 economists, Stefan Durkheim at Oxford and Chris Blattman at Columbia, where they actually randomly gave some people jobs at a manufacturing plant in Ethiopia, and they gave some people cash. And the people that got the jobs wound up with health problems, and the people that got the cash increased income by about 1/3.
Ian Goff, there is another point here, actually just touched on there, and it's made by the tech entrepreneur Elon Musk. Only in the last few days, the impact of automation on the job market, we're about to see it making a revolutionary change, particularly for those at the low end of the income scale. That will mean that some form of basic income may become inevitable, in his view. I mean, could technology overtake us on this one?
I think this is one reason why it's become such a live issue at the moment. The argument that automation and new technology will drive out jobs. This argument's been made for 200 years since the birth of capitalism, and it's never happened yet. And I'm not convinced that we're going to see a great productivity bonus pushing people out of work. If anything, the productivity rates are coming down.
Michael Tanner, do you think we're going to see a basic income in our lifetimes?
There's a general recognition that the existing structures of the welfare state are not succeeding. They're not lifting people out of poverty, but they are costing a great deal of money. And frankly, you can't redistribute wealth if you don't create wealth. And the more we tax and the more burden we have on the productive sector, the less money we have to redistribute. We're going to have to look for new structures And I think that this is probably the most promising idea that's out there.
OK, Michael Fay, I mean, a final thought. There is a general argument out there put about by economists that as soon as you start tinkering with welfare and the way that you give money away, the way that you distribute it, you have a series of unintended consequences. I mean, isn't there a risk here that, we're releasing something from a Pandora's box that we just don't fully understand if we did something on this scale?
And I think that's exactly why you test it. And I think cash has been one of the most thoroughly researched interventions of the last few decades. We have a lot of evidence that cash works. We have a bit to learn about how universal basic income differs from other cash programs.
Can I just add that I think experiments are very important, and I think especially the results we're getting from emerging economies, from India, show very clearly the nutritional benefits and the gender benefits from pilots. However, I don't think we necessarily need an experiment to make the case for basic income, in the sense that we live in a monetized world where work has grown increasingly precarious. And if we are accepting that persons can have entitlement to basic healthcare and education free of charge, it seems to me a missing piece in the modern welfare state, that we think the state has a right to monitor and punish people depending on how they behave in the labour market. If we want to incentivize people and support their motivation to work, which I see as inherent in human beings, it is a much better idea to give them basic security and enable persons to renegotiate their contracts in the labour market. And who knows where that will take us.
We're going to have to leave it there. My thanks to all my guests. Ian Goff at the London School of Economics, Professor Louise Haag of the Basic Income Earth Network, Michael Fay, founder of the charity Give Directly, and Michael Tanner from the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. Next week, we'll be talking about the person that every CEO fears in a company, the activist investor. In recent years, we've seen more and more of them waging campaigns for good or ill. Their targets often increasingly diverse these days. We're asking who really benefits in the long term from these activists, and could one of them be coming to a company near you? That's In the Balance next week. For now, from me and from all the team here, take care.